evening that we're about to have together. Showing Up for Racial Justice Bay Area is part of a national network of groups and individuals organizing white people for racial justice. Through community organizing, mobilizing, and education, SURGE moves white people to act as part of a multiracial majority through passion and accountability for justice. Before we get started with the program, I want to point out our accessibility lead tonight, Anaya. Our scent-free rows are here, and you can find accessible bathrooms through those doors. If you need anything tonight, Anaya is the person for you. To begin, let's all just take a moment to breathe, center, and really just come into this room. Let's acknowledge that we are gathered here this evening on the ancestral homeland of the Ohlone people, who are the indigenous inhabitants of the San Francisco Bay Area and have been here for thousands of years prior to colonization of Europeans. To this day, the Ohlone people continue to stand strong in the face of ongoing colonization. We welcome you to support Ohlone resistance efforts by joining the campaign to save the West Berkeley Shell Mound and Village site, which is the oldest inhabited site in the entire Bay Area and is at imminent risk for further desecration in the name of housing development. You can find out more about their campaign in our newsletter or by searching online, including on their Facebook group. And if you're interested in learning more about SURGE, we'd love to see you at our next intro meeting on Wednesday, April 25th at the Sierra Club from 7 to 9. Please sign up for our weekly newsletter after the program in the lobby or find us online at surgebayarea.org. Finally, I am so excited to share with you tonight a live taping of the podcast Speak Out with Tim Wise. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to two leaders in the forefront of policy and advocacy work on behalf of incarcerated Californians, the formerly incarcerated, and their families, Taina Vargas Edmond and Dorsey Nunn. Taina is executive director of Initiate Justice, which she founded with her husband, Richard Vargas Edmond, in September 2016. Prior to creating Initiate Justice, she worked as the statewide advocacy coordinator with SE Justice Group, state campaigner with the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, and worked as a field representative for the California State Assembly. Currently, her organization, Initiate Justice, is at the forefront of a campaign to restore voting rights to approximately 162,000 people in state prisons and on parole in California. Dorsey is a leading expert in criminal justice reform with over 40 years of professional experience. He is the first formerly incarcerated director of a public interest law office in California. Under his leadership, Legal Services for Prisoners with Children, All of Us Are None, has made significant advances and legal victories, including the Ashker lawsuit that ended long-term solitary confinement in California, and policy victories, including numerous ban-the-box laws and the RISE Act, which is the biggest drug sentencing reform passed by the California legislature in recent history. And joining Taina and Dorsey on the stage is educator and writer Tim Wise, who has authored 7 books, including his latest, Under the Affluence, Shaming the Poor, Praising the Rich, and Sacrificing the Future of America, and his highly acclaimed memoir, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. A popular campus speaker, Wise has spoken in all 50 states at over 1,000 colleges and high schools and to community groups across the country. He is the host of the weekly podcast Speak Out with Tim Wise, which is happening right now, which focuses on racial and economic justice in the age of Trump. His guests have included some of the nation's leading scholars, activists, and artists, as well as grassroots organizers, and tonight he'll be uplifting the work of Taina and Dorsey to a national stage on his podcast. Let's give them all a round of applause.
Thank you. So let me give you a few heads up things about how this will work. The podcast is being taped tonight. What will happen is, I'm not going to do a setup. Normally on the show, if you listen to the show, you know that I do about a 15-minute commentary at the beginning. I will patch that in later. Not going to waste time doing that here. And just want to really sort of get into the questions with these amazing guests that I'm glad, really honored to be in this space with. And yesterday, if you got to hear on the radio, we were able to do an interview together, and I was honored to be in the room with them then as well. I will tell you a couple of things that, the purpose of the podcast. I want to sort of get you a sense of why we're doing this podcast, Speak Out with Tim Wise, and I'm doing it in conjunction with the fine folks at Speak Out with whom I've been affiliated for almost a quarter century now. The idea behind it really is to do the thing that we're doing in here tonight, which is whenever possible and overwhelmingly, disproportionately to lift up the work of folks of color doing amazing things, lots of which are not necessarily heard about by the sort of masses and not covered in the mainstream press, the corporate press. And so out of the 33 or so guests that I've had up to this point on 30 shows, I've very deliberately tried to make sure that the disproportionate number of those are folks of color, most of whose names are not household names, very much on purpose, because I think it's critical in general, for the work of grassroots activists and organizational leaders to be held up, and especially as a white person in this work, I know that is my responsibility. It's also the responsibility of the folks in Surge. It's why they're obviously sponsoring this event, and I want to hold up their efforts in that regard as well. So with that, we'll just get into it. We will do a Q&A, do about roughly an hour, quote unquote, show. It will ultimately be edited down a little bit just for clarity and content and like taking out coughs and wheezing or whatever the hell happens up here. I got asthma, so you really never know, like some weird stuff can happen. And then we'll do a Q&A, and so if you are in any way like not wanting to be on tape, then you need to wait till about 20 minutes of the Q&A are over, because we only got apparently 80 minutes worth of recording time. So once we're 80 minutes in, you can just ask it, and you won't even be on tape. If you want to be on tape, you need to get in that question quick, I guess is what I'm trying to tell you. So we'll just start. The first thing I want to ask you both, and either one of you can start. We spend a lot of time, those of us who do organizing and political work, spend a lot of time telling people what we think. In a sense, that's our job. So we talk about what we think about an issue, or we talk about what we think about someone's political analysis, or we talk about what we think about a particular piece of legislation. We don't spend nearly as much time talking about and telling people why we think what we think and why we know what we know. And there's a difference, and it's an important one, because sometimes I think we think, well, I think I have my beliefs because I just know they're right, and I've thought about them, and they're the best beliefs. But actually, our understanding of the world, and our understanding, and tonight what we're talking about, the criminal justice system, doesn't just come from stuff we've read, and it doesn't just come from stuff we learned in a classroom, that's for sure. In fact, often it doesn't come from that at all. It comes from real lived experience. And I think sometimes if we know why a person has the narrative that they have, and why they have the convictions that they have, and the beliefs that they have, and the wisdom that they have, it gives us a greater insight into the depth of that wisdom. So rather than tell me what you think, we'll get to that, tell me why you think the things that you think, and why you know the things that you know based on your own life experience when it comes to this thing that we try to call the justice system in this country.
Well, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Serge, very much for putting on this amazing event. I'm very humbled to be part of this incredible conversation. So why I think it's important to end mass incarceration, why I think it's important for us to move away from a punishment-based system to a restorative justice-based system is because I am a person who grew up without the language to identify what was happening around me, but definitely very much harmed by this system of mass criminalization. My parents were both caught up in the war on drugs, were addicted to crack cocaine. My dad was in and out of jail my entire life, and which resulted in me having to get a job at the age of 14 to help take care of the family. My brother and sister have both been arrested at various points in their life and have both battled with addiction as well. But I didn't see myself as someone who was directly impacted by this issue until I was 22 years old and my partner got arrested and was facing multiple life sentences for an offense in which he never actually put his hands on anybody. So at that point, it kind of forced me to shift my thinking and like really reevaluate and look back on what happened in my life. Because I grew up with so much resentment towards my parents that I didn't see how the system had really harmed them and how the system had failed them. And it allowed me to put everything into a context. And in moving through what I have been going through with my husband now for the past 6.5 years, it made me realize that our communities are hurting, our families are being destroyed, are being torn apart, and it's supposedly in the name of public safety, but we, have one of the most violent developed countries in the world, and we have the most incarcerated developed country in the world. So it made me think like we are doing something wrong. So what is it going to take to shift narratives, to shift policy, and to create a world in which we're actually repairing harm and making it so that communities are safe and communities are allowed to stay together when harm is caused?
I think I like to start off by thanking Serge. Not so much for the night, but the first time that I ran into Serge was almost immediately after the Donald Trump election. And I needed to see a different group of white people. I really did. I was feeling a little bit put upon. And I needed, because I was confused. I didn't know how come so many white people voted for Trump. So when I came here, I sort of, relaxed, and I felt like Trump made me some new friends. So, at first I was bitter. At the end, it was like, it was a kumbaya moment, But the question was, why do I think the way I think? And it's sort of hard to answer because I probably could say it started off with my father being beat up by the police in my living room when I was a kid. Or I can tell you about time that I got to prison. The police had already shot at me three different times and tried to kill me. Or I can tell you that when I walked into prison, it was jarring because I come from San Mateo County, and in that county history, I think that we've only had one black elected official in a county-wide election in the history of the county, and that still may be true right now. So it was sort of jarring to walk into a prison system, and the thing was black and brown, which was different than the county that I was raised in. You could see it. It wasn't something that you can ignore. And, and I didn't have the basis to really wrestle with the questions because the educational system I came from did such a poor job that I barely could read. So at first, I didn't have the ability to articulate the degree of which I was oppressed and the confusion at seeing so many black men in prison. And not only did I see so many black men in prison, I was confused about seeing so many black men in prison that I knew from my community. Now, I can sort of speculate that at the point that I went to prison, I was possibly an asshole.
Did we go to cussing, huh? We had this conversation last time that he has permission to cuss in the church because his mother helped found the church. So it's all good. I had to ask for a special dispensation, but apparently he's all right.
But I couldn't explain how come all the people that I thought had such great potential wind up in the same place. I couldn't explain for the people that I went to elementary school went to junior high school, hung out in front of the local restaurant smoking weed, that I thought that ultimately would become doctors, lawyers, and all these other fine things. I couldn't figure out how did we all wind up in the same dilemma. That was probably the beginning of what made me think the way that I felt. But the other reality is that thoughts alone don't secure my freedom. You know, so whatever y'all think, it's really great that y'all think that, but if y'all ain't helping me, so what? So I just got to put it in real terms. So I can say that I went to prison, and when I didn't know how to read that well, that members of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army and the Black guerrilla family started teaching me how to read. And even more importantly, they started teaching me how to reason. You know, and so like, I guess, you know, I think the way that I think, in part because I've seen people abused. And it was further accented by actually being provided with some direction of not what to think, but how to think.
Well, the reason I asked the question was I think people who don't understand this issue of mass incarceration, particularly of black and brown bodies, who don't understand the way the carceral state works and the way in which it is so vital for us to push against it, will say, you know, they don't reflect on their experiences that have led them to be dismissive of this. They don't value your experiences. They don't value the experiences of others that have imparted real wisdom, as you just shared with us. And they don't ever really sit back and reflect on the fact that the very reason they can't hear you and the very reason they can't see you and know what you know is because their life experience has been so fundamentally different. And I think if we all sort of start to reflect on the fact that our experiences shape our perceptions, shapes our understanding, that we can have much deeper conversations about this, but people don't want to own it. They want to say, you know, I know that these people who we lock away are bad because they have, quote unquote, done a bad thing. They see them very one-dimensionally, just as they see themselves very one-dimensionally. So to them, they say, well, I am a law-abiding person, and that is a law-breaking person, and that's all we need to know. And you said something, Dorsey, that I want to follow up on, and I want you both to weigh in on, because I think it's a critical next question. You said this piece about when you started reflecting on all these folks you grew up with and you knew who had all this potential, and they ended up in the same place. And that speaks to the lack of one-dimensionality. That speaks to the multi-dimensionality of people, including the folks who are inside, and including the folks who maybe are not inside yet, but are waiting for trial and haven't been adjudicated guilty, but are sitting, you know, because of a cash bail system that they can't afford, sitting there waiting for trial, whatever it is. What do we need to know? And when I say we, I don't just mean the people in this room. What do people who are going to be listening to this podcast who don't maybe have a lot of contact with folks who were formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated need to know about those who come into this system and go through this system that they don't know, that they need to understand about folks so we can add 2 and 3 and multi-dimensions to people who we see as cardboard cutouts? So if you had to explain to average everyday folks who don't engage these conversations yet, something they need to know about these folks and these families that are affected and the individuals who are impacted, what would you want them to know that you figure they don't know yet?
That y'all don't ever think that I could be an asset, and you always think that I'm a liability, and you always think that you're helping the downtrodden. I could be possibly here to save your ass. You know, on the real, because at a certain point, when I actually measure my trajectory, and I've been at this 40 years, at a certain point, I'm from East Palo Alto, At one point, I'm the largest employer in my city. You never would think that I was the person that when we was talking about a drug war that I got out and helped build a community-based rehabilitation center, and we didn't provide over 100,000 units of service. You never would have thought that after I learned how to read, that me and Angela Davis and some other folks took an obscure term out of a Mike Davis book and taught you how to think about it and to actually reason. And that term was the PrisonIndustrial Complex. You never would know that at a certain point, when we talked about ban the box, that we took an effort that was led and that was developed by formerly incarcerated people and pushed that thing to more than 50% of the country live up under a policy that was pushed out by formerly incarcerated people who didn't have any money. You never would know that currently, probably for the last decade, that I've been managing a budget over $1 million a year. You never would know those things. And you never would know that I'm a father, that I'm a grandfather, and that I'm a great-grandfather, which is absolutely the thing that I'm the most proud of. I'm more proud of that status than I am being given a prestigious award by the President of the United States in the White House. You never would know that when people walk into my office and they see all these prestigious awards, they ask me, which one is the most important? And the one that I normally hold up is not the certificate I got by being a champion of change for the White House. It's the one that I got from my homies that gave it to me after 20 years. It was the White House. They didn't know me. My homies really did know me. You know, so when they gave me the award, coming from a program that I helped build, it took them 20 years to give me that. You know, I have fed every one of them. You know, so like the part that if it's anything that I got to say, it's right now. The first time that I came here, I talked about gentrification in Oakland and I was looking for a building. On the 23rd, I acquired property in Oakland to buy a building. But it's not a building that I'm buying. I'm buying into a vision that I got the ability to build the Freedom and Movement Center, where we would teach countless people getting out of prison on how to change public policy. Because it's a real distinction between I feel something, then I do something. And by the way, the Black Panther Party taught me that the social criteria of the truth is the practice. So I operate on the practice. So when I say what you say, don't mean as much as what you do. So like, if I can tell you anything, of real substance, is that I still believe at 66, after serving a life sentence, that I have the ability to change the universe. How many of you have been able to hold on to your beliefs that firmly in light of being given a life sentence, being tear gassed, being beaten, being locked up, and being promised that you would never get out of prison, to hold on to your visions and your dreams of you being an individual that's capable of great achievements?
folks ask that question a lot. What would you want people to know about people who are in prison or people who are impacted by incarceration? And the sad truth is, the first thing that I always want to say is that we are people. And I feel like that's something that we always need to remind folks. I feel like our culture, we treat people in such a disposable way, where if you make a mistake or if you cause harm or, God forbid, you break the law, then you're disposable. You're not a person anymore. You don't have rights anymore. We can kidnap you away from your family and community, lock you in a cage, and not think about what happens to you for X amount of years according to how egregious your crime was, but in reality, according to what color your skin is, what your income is, and where you grew up. So, in my experience, in being a woman with an incarcerated loved one, I spend every single weekend inside of a prison with people who society tells you to be terrified of. Cops have said things to me before, like, be careful, you're in there with murderers, and things to that nature. Our standard of dress is so heavily regulated when you're inside, because we're made to think that if we wear something tight, or if you can see my shoulder blade, then I'm gonna be attacked when I'm in prison. But my honest opinion is that I feel safer almost nowhere else than inside the visiting room, because I know I'm with families, because I know I'm with community, because I know that we can check each other much better than the cops can. I tell them that every time I go up in there, because I'm a regular, they'll make little comments to me about, when is your husband getting out? I'm like, let him come home now. Me and my family and my community can do a much better job of keeping him in check than you in the system can. So, another thing that was news to me, that really was an observation for me, is the way the folks who are currently incarcerated take time to really reflect on themselves and think through what actions cause them to be in the situation where they are, to do that really hard work on yourself. I know for sure I have not done even a tenth of the work on myself the most incarcerated people have, because you're put in this situation where all you're stuck with is your thoughts. You're put in a cage, and all you have is time to think about why you're here, to think about this. And folks are so resilient. They can't just sit there and say, I'm mad at this system, this is unjust, this is unfair. They take the time and look at themselves. They lift each other up. My husband has been in more groups than I can possibly imagine, and he is always telling me, if I have a problem, he has all of these tools and all of these steps for me to work on resolving it. And I'm just what are y'all even doing in here? You need to be out here teaching everybody else, because we're all out here running around wondering why we have all these problems, but none of us have taken the time to turn around and look at ourselves. So I think that is, I have met the most incredible people in the world in prison. I have met them in the lines waiting to see their loved ones, and just the resilience. This system is designed to break us down in every way possible, to strip us of our loved ones, to strip us of our financial stability, to strip us of our mental and emotional health. And yet you have people in there not only surviving, but thriving. So what I would want to know about folks in prison is that, yes, folks have made a mistake, just like we all have made mistakes in my life. I broke laws coming here. I was speeding. I made an illegal U-turn, where people can't act like they don't break the law. But what I have learned about interacting with folks who are impacted by incarceration is that, man, we have so much to learn from folks who can get through that and survive.
Touched me a lot. At a certain point, I'm going through this life sentence, and I'm running in and out of the board trying to get out of prison. And I'm trying to find exactly the right story to tell people to let me out. While working on myself, because I did a lot of stuff to make me think about things. Recently, I had this unbelievable trajectory of success, that at the end of it is that I recognize that my growth patterns is still emerging, right? And I need to yell to the top of my lungs the question that they kept asking me over and over again. They kept saying, we don't see any remorse. I believe that's the word they use, sorrow, regret, insight, and all the rest of that. You know, I really feel like going back and telling them, it's hard to sort that out when you're trying to choke the life out of me. You know, so like if you're trying to kill me, the thing I feel like I need to be taken care of is how to survive. So at this point, it was running into my grandkids, my great-grandkids, and my kids that made me have different reflections about what and how I needed to act as a human being a lot more. So it's like all the stuff that I did in prison didn't impact me as greatly as the promises that my daughter extracted, the promises my family extracted. They extracted more. I mean, the people at the board, you know, like, hey, they weren't my friends or my family. I was supposed, you know, if you got the truth there, you know, that was just luck. But the reality of it is what I was telling myself and telling my families were truths that actually modified behavior and modified expectation of myself, mainly.
So you all both sort of touched on the way that this particular carceral state, this system, is intended to break you, intended to disrespect you, intended to stigmatize anyone who is incarcerated or even the family of those who are incarcerated, and really, if nothing else, to either seek remorse, which really is this self-negation, this way of saying that I'm sorry for being the bad person that you think I am, which is really just another way of destroying your soul, whether thought of literally or figuratively. There's another thing the system does, and we touched on it a bit yesterday in the radio program, but there was a question I didn't get to ask. So for those who heard the show yesterday morning, we were discussing as we all know, sort of the financial incentives that exist for mass incarceration and the way that, whether it's private prisons or whether it's state prisons using inmates for the making of furniture and other jobs that they do for 25 cents a day or whatever it is, depending on the state. And that's the part we all sort of talk about and that we know about when we think about the prison industrial complex. There's this other piece that we didn't get into yesterday, though, and I'd like to get your take on it, because what the system also does is it not only seeks to break down disproportionately people of color, communities of color, and poor communities of all colors, it also seeks to pit communities against one another. And one of the ways it does it, as I think many of us know, is by placing prisons in places far away from the places where most of the incarcerated live. So you take disproportionately black and brown bodies from urban areas, you put them in rural areas that are overwhelmingly white, oftentimes also economically marginal, and now what you've done is you have created an incentive for mass incarceration in the minds of these people whose jobs are now tied to the carceral state, whose livelihoods are tied to it, and of course what we don't talk about enough but need to is the fact that when you take those black and brown bodies out of the cities and you put them in the rural area, they now count on the census rolls for the rural area, which means that they now get more federal money because the federal money disbursements are based on census numbers, but the new people who live in their town don't get to use their libraries, don't get to use their schools, don't get to use their public services, so they are actually getting taxation without representation in a sense, and reverse Robin Hood, putting money into the hands of these folks coming out of communities like Oakland, for instance. This happens in every state. So given the fact that the system has created this perverse incentive for folks in those communities, even if they're not personally particularly racist and classist and committed to oppression, but you've created this financial incentive for them to view themselves as the eternal enemy of justice and change and de-incarceration. How do we think about movement building given that set of incentives? What are the things we need to do to try to build connection with those folks? Because I do believe there are some ways to connect and to actually demonstrate the dysfunctionality of the carceral state, even for those communities, but I don't think we talk about that enough. Do y'all have thoughts on that? That's an easy question, but I just thought I would ask it anyway. Go ahead.
Okay. So Tim, you actually touched on a philosophy of mine that I actually disagree with my husband about often, is where I don't think that education is really the only way that you're going to be able to change somebody's mind on an issue. A lot of times if you're talking to somebody about racism, classism, sexism, things like that, and you're trying to sway them using information and statistics, they have their own bias. So they're not going to really want to change their mind no matter how much, how many facts you throw at them. It's in their personal, political, financial interest to continue to hold those beliefs. So I really don't feel confident speaking on how are we going to shift the financial incentives to a more restorative public safety system. But I know a way that we can start to change this is the narrative, because the narrative that works so effectively in the mass incarceration system is public safety. We are told from a very young age that the police and prisons are what keep us safe. We are told from a very young age that there are good guys and that there are bad guys, and that there is no in-between, and that if you want to feel safe, the bad guys have to be taken away. They have to be arrested, removed from the communities. So breaking up that narrative and showing that the way that we are treating people when they cause harm is actually counterintuitive to promoting communities that are safe is something that we really need to show. I don't think that the way that we're going to win is really getting sympathy for people who commit a crime. I think that what we're actually going to have to show is that what we're doing is not working. I know, Dorsey, you probably know, in any other organization that provides services, if you want to get funding for something, you have to show that your program is effective. You have to show that what you're doing is working. And my background is in political science, and I've done a lot of state policy work, and I follow the state budget, and I see anytime any entity goes to the government and says that we need to get funding for something, they have to show that they're evidence-based. They have to show that they are achieving the goals that they say that they are going to achieve. The exception is the prison system. The prison system has shown overwhelmingly that they are a failure. California, our recidivism rate is going down now, but it's still hovering somewhere around 60%. So in what world does an organization that has a 60% failure rate get funded $11.4 billion? That's the budget for the prison system this year. But it's because of that narrative. It's because of those lies that are told. It's because we're saying, it'll be anarchy. People will be getting killed in the streets, and you won't be able to walk out of your house without getting robbed if we don't have this system. So what we really need to do is break up that narrative. And I think something that we haven't been as effective of doing is really building up these alternatives and showing what it can actually look like when we're investing in people so that they don't end up in prison in the first place. What does it look like when you are investing in somebody's transformation? Giving them not only a second chance, a third, fourth, fifth, sixth chance sometimes, because sometimes it's hard. People are traumatized. People are making mistakes. People are making bad decisions and causing harm, but we need to understand why folks are doing that and giving them opportunities and encouragement to do better. And then thinking about what folks are doing when they come home. How are we helping them succeed in their reentry? How are we, Dorsey and I were talking about the importance of families. The prisons are so far away from people. It is so expensive. It is traumatizing to go and visit somebody in prison because of the way you're treated by correctional officers. So the way the system is designed, it keeps families apart. And every study that you can possibly look at will show that when people maintain close relationships with their loved ones, they are more likely to have successful reentry when they're coming home. So we need to think about how are we keeping folks together, how are we maintaining those bonds, and how are we supporting people when they come home.
You remember when I thanked Serge? Y'all demonstrated that y'all were allies. And I think that's fundamentally important is your practice. Last time I came, I said we was gonna do a quest for democracy. I'm back telling you I'm getting ready to do another quest for democracy. And I'm inviting you to come because we get to know each other when we stand beside each other. So if y'all living on the other side of the bridge, the railroad tracks, or the freeway, we may not get to know each other that well. So maybe if we enjoying our struggles, we can do something. So on the 30th, we're gonna be in Sacramento and we're gonna be demanding policy change. So I got to say, I want to invite everybody here to join us in Sacramento. You know, the other thing that you said what they need to show, something that you perpetually show, whether it's intentional or unintentional, is that I'm always broken. I'm always inadequate. So whether we creating programs or not creating programs, the basic premise is that I'm in search of fixing. And we need to build stuff to fix me. Whether it be the drug programs, or whether it be the trade schools. And I think as long as we changing that narrative by having at its core basis that I'm inadequate, I don't know how I acquire equality, let alone equity. So at a certain point, I think that when I first started to learn how to read, some brother passed me, Ralph Ellison, The Invisible Man. And I recognized that my suffering and my pain is being hidden behind the rhetoric. So, like, we won't admit that we still currently hold slaves, even though you can force me to work at gunpoint inside the prison for absolutely nothing. I mean, it gets so fundamentally corrupt that when I'm being assaulted, you can hide that assault behind language like it's in the best interest of the security of the institution. So when you strap me down on a bed, give me a digital rectal search, you can't admit that you possibly raped me. And when you have me pull off my clothes and do the dance of a slave, you can't admit that you assault me on a regular basis. So we don't even have language to describe the level of assault. So if we're going to change a dominative narrative, perhaps we need to make some candid admissions of what we're doing with human beings. When you say that you want to be known as people, and I says I'm a formerly incarcerated person, I can take you into circles when you call somebody an offender. It's like calling them a nigger. Or when you call them a felon, it's like calling them a nigger. The emphasis that I'm a human being and I refuse to allow you to continue to describe me in such a way that it don't allow you to acknowledge that I'm a human being. So, just think about it. Most of the time we come home from prison, we may have a whole host of needs, but you only acknowledge what you think mine are. You have a whole host of needs too. Like, you need jobs to do this shit on me with. There I go. That's all right. But, you know, it's like along the way, it's like 2 weeks ago, I just came back from Portugal. I built a drug program, then I go to a different country that had at its basis that addiction was a health issue. Now I got to reshuffle the deck about what I do in my community based on having that knowledge. But sometimes I don't think that we collectively engage in that educational process, because I think that what we do is that sometimes we confuse education with indoctrination. Maybe one day I'll get a degree, put some alphabets behind my name. Maybe you can really hear me and understand what I'm trying to tell you in the most politest way that I can tell you. Is that I wasn't broken, so I suspect at some point they probably shoot me. I wasn't broken, so at some point I sort of figure like the trail that I'm on, fighting for liberation, will ultimately take me back to prison or take me to the graveyard. I've been on that trail my entire life, so I don't suspect, like anybody that really do this work in honesty, in a society that is as corrupt as this one, that you get to the mountaintop. Most people that obligate themselves to this fight recognize that you could only do is move the dial a little bit and maybe another generation to move it further.
So, speaking of this moving the dial kind of imagery, it's sort of a interesting time, I think, and that's putting it sort of very mildly, I think, to, you don't even know what the rest of the question is, but you already know it's good. You know where I'm headed, I think. It's an interesting time to be doing this kind of work, and by this kind of work, I mean criminal justice reform, prison reform work, both in California and in the United States more broadly, though I think for two very different reasons. It's interesting, right? On the one hand, you all have, the two of you and the organizations to which you're connected and the folks who are in the networks that you're a part of have had some impressive victories in this state in the last several years. And we talked about some of those at the outset in the introduction in your bio. And so there is some movement on the ground. And we're going to talk near the end about how the folks in this room can connect with your organizations to keep that movement going in a forward direction. But that's also happening against a backdrop nationally that is quite a bit different, where Trumpism and Jefferson Beauregard Sessionsism within the judge, because I'm from the South, I got to emphasize the Beauregard, because you know, because I can get away with that, because I'm sure I got 5 or 6 Beauregards in my family at some point. With Jeff Sessions and Trump singing a very different tune about incarceration, about the war on drugs, about stop and frisk, about racial profiling, about all of these issues. The question I have, though, is not, what do you think about the national scene? Because I think the answer to that's fairly obvious. My question's a little different. Is there a danger? Obviously, it's better to try to be doing this work here than a lot of places, given the fact that you've had some forward motion. But is there any danger in the fact that you're trying to do the work in a state that is now getting known, for right or for wrong, as the resistor state, the quote-unquote liberal/progressive state? Is there a danger in that as you do the work? I know what's the good part of it. It's easier to do the work here than in Alabama. It's easier to do the work here than in a lot of places that are under the guise of Trumpism much more strongly. But I'm worried about the possible downsides, because, you know, in my experience, sometimes when you get that head full of I'm the liberal one, or we're the liberal one, right? It can also make you a little, I don't know, take for granted how hard the work still is in a place that has that reputation. So talk a little bit about concerns that you have about trying to do this work in spite of the success, in spite of the progress in a place like California.
Well, I'm gonna be, Dorsey, you can tell me how you feel, but I feel like California really does have this reputation for being liberal and for being progressive, and we are in so many areas, except for mass incarceration. I mean, California, we have the highest correctional budget out of any other state. We have the highest incarceration rate out of any other state and the highest population of people who are incarcerated. We have a lot more barriers than other states that are seen as more conservative. So I think that California has been kind of hiding behind this facade of being liberal and being progressive, and criminal justice has kind of been the area where legislators and policymakers feel comfortable in saying, like, okay, we're going to make the right happy on this issue. We're going to make law enforcement happy on this issue. So I feel like in this moment where California is getting this reputation nationally for being liberal and for being progressive and for being the resistors, I'm saying let's capitalize on this and let's actually be the progressive things that we are getting this reputation for being. I know, so with Initiate Justice, most of our work has been around ballot initiatives versus going through the legislative process, because the legislature, even though we have a Democratic supermajority, it is almost impossible to get like really significant criminal justice legislation moved through. I know, Dorsey, you've been doing this work forever. I'm sure almost every single bill that you have started did not end up the way that you wanted it to look, because you have to take so many amendments, and then you have, you know, these groups and that groups who want to oppose you, but it's not even the typical opposition who you would think it would be. Right now, folks are circulating a petition to get something on the ballot in November to roll back gains that we made with criminal justice reform initiatives, Prop 47 and Prop 57, and the main proponent of that initiative is a Democratic state legislator. So I think that what we really need to do is kind of like disabuse ourselves of this comfortable notion that we're a progressive state, sit in the uncomfortable reality and break that shit up.
I'm glad somebody else got to call up too. Last year, we banned the box in the state of California for the entire state. The Ban the Box campaign started in California. We banned it last year. Do you recognize how many other states I had banned the box in before we banned it in California? You know, how about Minnesota? It ain't like that's the liberal bastion, the bastion of liberalism. You know what I'm saying? So it's, the contradiction is there. When we banned the box initially in San Francisco, everybody kept talking about liberal San Francisco. We fought our ass off to do that. You know, we might have been a little bit liberal about, like, you know, the sexual preference thing, but all the rest of it, it wasn't like we were liberal about sharing the money. We wasn't liberal about making sure that black people had places to live in San Francisco. We wasn't liberal about, like, who did you charge that was smoking weed? We put them in prison first and in jail first. So that notion about that we're liberal as a state, it's not necessarily true. And when we talk about narratives, and we fighting for the right to vote, you only hear the right to vote. For me, my fight is the full inclusion of my civil, my human rights, and it's a demand for citizenship. That's right. Because at a certain point, everything that we're demanding reflects that we lack those things that y'all wouldn't necessarily attribute to being a citizen of the country. Whether it's jury service or whether it's the right to vote. If those things are not accessible to me in this liberal state, I don't know if we can really hold that notion up with a sense of pride, because it may not be true for all of us. You know, and I really do believe in all of us and none. That's how come we got an organization named that. You know, so that notion that we're extremely liberal, I don't know if that's true. I think the people in Oklahoma just discovered that what they thought was only my issue as a incarcerated or formerly incarcerated person, I don't know how they felt about it when they said, we can't give you a raise because we pumped the money into the criminal justice system. So it's really all of us and none, because like if we let them keep pumping money there, we may not have the health care that we want. We may not have access to your institutions of higher education. Berkeley may not be cheap anymore. We might have done already sacrificed that. So at a certain point, when I says people look at me as the downtrodden, and I said I could be the helpful person, that's what I mean, because some of the notions that we hold on to is not only oppressive to me, it's oppressive to you, whether you recognize it or not.
So we probably have time for one more question before we get into the Q&A session and announcements. Got about 10 minutes, and that'll probably be enough time for both of you to answer this one. I want you to give me sort of a short-term, long-term. So for the folks in the room and for the listeners on the program when this is broadcast, if you had to pick one thing right now in the short term, a policy thing, a movement thing that folks in this room can get behind and get involved in, what would that be? And then I want you to give me one thing each that isn't necessarily on the horizon yet. It's not on the table yet. It's not a policy that, that's going to happen anytime soon, but that down the line we got to move toward a more long-term type change within the system. So a short-term that's right in front of us that folks can get involved in right now, and a long-term that we need to be building towards. If you can give me one each of those, that'd be great.
I feel like both of mine are both short-term and long-term. I think what we need to be doing on an ongoing basis is continuing to build the power of people who are directly impacted by incarceration, including and especially people who are in prison and in jail right now. There are a lot of folks who are super well-meaning and do all of this amazing policy work around ending mass incarceration, but as you were saying earlier, Dorsey, folks who are in prison or folks who are formerly incarcerated are viewed overwhelmingly as people who need to be helped, people who need resources, people who need support, and those things are true, just like we all need resources and support, but I don't think that we as a movement are doing a good enough job of recognizing people in prison and their loved ones as the leaders of this movement. They should be the ones who are crafting the policies. They should be the ones who we are reaching out to when we're implementing the policies that were passed. They are the most direct stakeholders, and they are the ones who are almost always left out of every single conversation. So that is... And it's hard, right? Like Initiate Justice, most of our membership are people who are currently inside. And it's a lot more difficult to maintain a membership of folks who you have to physically write a letter to every time you want to contact them versus sending an email or posting something on social media, also knowing that the Department of Corrections is probably going to try and mess with your mail and they might not ever get it, or they'll send it back because they say it's contraband, or whatever excuse they have. It's hard, when you can't meet with people in person without going through arduous approval processes to be in there. So there are a lot of barriers to keep us from organizing people who are inside, but those barriers are there for a reason. They're intentional, and we need to break them up. So I think that I'll just make that my answer for both the short term and the long term. In the short term, we need to be thinking about what are we doing? Like, what can we do today to make sure that we are reaching out to folks who we know inside? What are we doing to support organizations who are building the infrastructure to build movements from the inside? What are we doing to change our own thinking to see people who are impacted by incarceration not as the problem, but as the solution? Because I promise you, nobody can figure out a way to end mass incarceration, to make our community safer, better than people who are locked up in cages right now. in the long term, I think that looks like policy changes, including what we're trying to do, which is first and foremost restore voting rights for people who are in prison and on parole in California. Because how are folks going to be policy leaders when they can't even vote for the DA who put them in prison? They can't vote for the judges who put them in prison. So I see Darius, you holding up the petition. We are almost at our deadline. So we are trying to collect almost 600,000 signatures to get the Voting Restoration and Democracy Act on the ballot this year to restore voting rights to about 162,000 people in prison in California and on parole, meaning if we got it passed, we would join states like Maine and Vermont that never take away your right to vote because you're incarcerated.
And because you're white.
So Maine and Vermont are also the first and second whitest states in the country, and I'm sure that's a big coincidence. But California being the most diverse and most populous state, we think it's really critical to do everything that we can to make this happen. And even if we don't qualify it for the ballot this time, the long-term vision is to make sure that folks stay in this fight for the long run. There are folks in Florida right now who just qualified their initiative to restore voting rights to about 1.6 million formerly incarcerated people. And it took them a long time for them to get the support, for them to get the funding and the resources. So, stick with us. Stick with folks who are directly impacted. Stick with folks who know exactly what we're talking about. Take risks on people. When you see people like me and, my husband and other people in prison who are a little bit more rough around the edges, trust us, we know what we're talking about.
I got to call his name since you mentioned Florida. Desmond Meade, a formerly incarcerated person that went through law school that can't be admitted into the bar. If I get to the point of just decide not to curse then. Because on the same point, I don't know how many times that we go to school with you and we prove we're taking the same test and we're not admitted to being able to do something because of licensing, right? That's what we're going to Sacramento to fight for real soon. Do we have, how many of y'all recognize that every time y'all have a forest fire, we putting that stuff out? Do you recognize we putting the fire out while we in prison but can't get a job as a fireman on the streets? So at a certain point, I stopped thinking that it was a question of inferior education and started thinking that it was structural in nature. It's the policies that we have in place. So my fight is how do I train people to be more than I am? Sandra, would you stand up? She's from my first class of Elder Freeman Fellows. She's responsible for banning the box in the state of California in the first year. Kim, would you stand up? Responsible for banning the box. Half the time y'all see me, I'm just making noise. They ain't putting in real work. I get to make pretty speeches. They ain't putting in real work. So I need to say that. Harry, stand up. She shackled in prison. So when you see my comrades, they work much harder than I do. I get to sit up here and have a Coca-Cola. Cut that out.
Well, I'm cutting that out.
Cut that out. I don't be pumping this stuff. But, you know, the reality is that I come here because I need your help. I come here and says, will you stand with us in Sacramento when we fight for our rights? That's what I come here to ask for. I ask you to support me, not just because of me. It's because we need to learn how to support the leadership of formerly incarcerated people so we will strengthen their voice. When I came here and I spoke about gentrification the first time around, I didn't talk about it in full terms. If you let Oakland be gentrified, we will not have an urban area in Northern California that can sustain a black culture. So y'all can talk about all the stuff that you want to talk about, but what do you do about the fight? Whatever you feel and whatever you think, that's real great stuff. You know, write a book about that shit. You know, make a poem or something. But I ask you to stand with me at those pivotal moments. On the 29th, we moving buses from San Diego. We moving buses from San Bernardino and Riverside. We moving buses from Los Angeles. We moving buses from Fresno. We moving buses from Stockton, filled up with formerly incarcerated people and their families and their allies. Richmond. You know, we got a couple of vans too. Right? But when I ask you for support, in order for these people to come down from these other places, I'm one of the primary fundraisers. So I wish I could say that I had the luxury to say, get back on the bus right after we go and ask them for our rights. But I done already taught people they have the right to be treated fairly. So they be saying, Dorsey, you done brought us all the way down here. We're going to spend the night. And we're going to eat. So like, what you can do in the short and long term is make sure that you actually support leadership of leaders. Because I wish I could say that I wasn't a leader, but then I'd be lying to you. At this point, I got a staff of 20. I got 5 people in my office that then graduated from law school. So I not only will hold a demonstration, I will sue your ass. You know, and I will move some policy too. Because I need, for my freedom, I need every art in the water. And what I'm insisting on doing is to make sure that at every point we can be anywhere in that continuum that allow us to be even the lawyers, even the demonstrators. And by the way, the next thing I'll probably be coming back to ask you for is that when we get into civil disobedience, I'm going to be passing around a list sooner or later asking y'all to go to jail because I cannot. And we cannot. We got to stand on the sidewalk while we fight for our rights. Some of y'all got the privilege of going to jail and getting out. Some of us then already lost that privilege. So what happened when we need to get really aggressive about what we want? And we need your support. So other stuff that I think that I should mention is just not the individual policies. So when I'm bringing people to Sacramento, I care about policies. But I care about the emergence and the development of movement because a policy is so transactional. The movement is what's going to take us into freedom. It's going to be all of us or it's going to be none. So I just need to keep emphasizing that. So what I want y'all to support is leadership of not only directly impacted people, But when it comes to a prison, civil and human rights, I'm actually to support our families and support people who are actually doing the leadership. And that actually costs, you know. So it's like if somebody got a bucket, give the money to Surge, because y'all showed up for me in a spot when we was afraid to go into Sacramento because we was having our policy day or our lobby. They don't even want you to say lobby if you're a 501c3. Our educational session. We was having our educational, because I got to learn your language because they don't want me to be honest. We was having our educational session with the locally elected officials. Surge showed up for us in a real big way. And I'm asking y'all to continue to show up for us, because what I can actually say is that if there's people who don't have any resources, it's probably formerly incarcerated people that's being structurally discriminated against. So if y'all are able to help, I will ask you to continue to help. But I would ask you not to just give up money, to stand with us, because we got to know that who our neighbors are, who is our allies, who is our comrades in this thing, this remarkable fight. Because like I said, I'm still grateful that I walked in to this particular room right after Trump was elected. And I said I would get more friends. The friends that we got that night, it came right after all the women marched on Washington, D.C. I felt a little bit better. Now the kids is beginning to march around guns, right? And maybe they'll figure out there's a difference when we keep holding people personally responsible and not hold people corporately responsible. So at a certain point, every time you're doing that narrative and you keep putting it on personal responsibility and you don't put it in a more collective application of responsibility, then I think you sell us all short. That was longer than I wanted to go, but
it's all right. It's all right. It's a good place to wrap up. Thank you.